They seem to me to have no real purpose in continuing the lockdown other than to spare themselves public criticism. But it's the mark of a statesman that you're prepared to stand up for the national interest and not simply to run away before public opinion, especially when you have, in a sense, created that public opinion yourself by frightening the daylights out of people over the last 8 weeks and trying to persuade them that this is a much more virulent epidemic than it actually is.
Do you know the number of people in this country who have died in hospitals in England since beginning of February to early December, who are healthy under the age of 60 with no underlying health problems, who have died of coronavirus? Do you know roughly what that number would be? Do you want to make a guess at what it might be?
So I don't know the precise number. What I would say is that
rough
we know
idea.
that
Rough idea. 10,000,
20,000,
20,000, 100?
Come on. We know that the overwhelming majority of people are the over 65s and those with multiple conditions, particularly respiratory or cardiovascular conditions. But I don't have the precise figure.
Do you want me to tell
happy
you the
to
number?
I'd love you to.
307.
Well, look, I appreciate this. We know more and more about the virus week by week, month by month, and we know disproportionately hits older people and those suffering with the conditions that we've described.
But the evidence is clear, isn't it, that this virus has taken a terrible toll on the population?
No, the evidence is not clear to that effect. More than 9/10 of the deaths are cases in which the death certificate shows that there were multiple causes of death, and coronavirus was only one of them. This is a virus that attacks people with really serious pre-existing vulnerabilities, and that's consistent with all the statistical analyses.
Yes, but they wouldn't necessarily have killed them at this point in time, would they? They might have lived with them for many years.
No, not for many years. Almost all of these people are very old and suffering from quite serious conditions serious enough to be mentioned as a cause of death on the certificate. The overwhelming majority of them would have died a bit later, but not much later anyway.
It has what's been calculated as an infection fatality rate. That is, if you catch the infection, the probability of you dying is 0.3%. So that means that 99.7% of people survive. 80% of people who catch this virus will be completely asymptomatic. Those people who do catch the virus, many of them, the effect will be like a bad flu. Those people who are actually hospitalized, then we do have very good treatments for these.
Most people, a significant proportion of people will not get this virus at all, at any point in the epidemic, which is going to go on for a long period of time. Of those who do, some of them will get the virus without even knowing it. They will have the virus with no symptoms at all, asymptomatic carriage, and we know that happens. Of those who get symptoms, the great majority, probably 80%, will have a mild or moderate disease. Might be bad enough for them to have to go to bed for a few days, not bad enough for them to have to go to the doctor. An unfortunate minority will have to go as far as hospital, but the majority of those will just need oxygen and will then leave hospital. And then a minority of those will end up having to go to severe and critical care, and some of those, sadly, will die. But that's a minority. It's 1% or possibly even less than 1% overall. And even in the highest risk group, this is significantly less than 20%, i.e. the great majority of people, even the very highest groups, if they catch this virus, will not die.
What I'm advocating now is that the lockdown should become entirely voluntary. It is up to us, not the state, to decide what risks we are going to take with our own bodies. Now, the traditional answer that people give to that is, well, but by going out or in the streets and in shops and things, you are infecting other people. But you don't have to take that risk. You can voluntarily self-isolate. You don't have to go into the streets. You don't have to go to the shops. People who feel vulnerable can self-isolate, and the rest of us can then get on with our lives. My choice would be that I would live a perfectly normal life. If the pubs were open now, I would go to a crowded pub with no hesitation. If the theatres were open now, I would go to the theatre with no hesitation. Because this is, for the overwhelming majority of people with no serious underlying conditions, this is a very mild epidemic.
Of those who get symptoms, the great majority, probably 80%, will have a mild or moderate disease. Might be bad enough for them to have to go to bed for a few days, not bad enough for them to have to go to the doctor.
In the Cabinet Office papers published with the National Risk Assessment, they have listed all the pandemics since 1918. The mortality of this one is right down the bottom, lower than any of the others. And I would happily take that risk.
Okay. And if you were an asymptomatic, let's imagine you were carrying the virus and you were asymptomatic and you carried on and your daily life and you went to the theatre and you sat next to someone who then did catch the virus from you and die from it. Would you think that that's part of an everyday risk that it was fine for them to have taken?
It has what's been calculated as an infection fatality rate. That is, if you catch the infection, the probability of you dying is 0.3%.
Well, it's up to them whether they want to take it. I would be running the risk of catching the virus from them if they're asymptomatic.
In all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks.
And I am prepared to take that risk. They don't have to go to the theatre. If they're not prepared to take it, presumably they won't go to the theatre. We are entitled to take risks with our own lives, especially when basically life is only worth living if you are prepared to engage in social activities which inevitably involve risk.
Have you observed the rules of the lockdown to date?
Yes.
Completely?
Yes.
Grudgingly, it sounds like.
Well, I disapprove of the lockdown. You can call that grudging if you like, but I comply with the law because I don't wish to place a weapon in the hands of people like you.
I mean, I'm merely interested in whether what you're putting forward is and how that compares with the way that you have lived your life in these last few weeks.
Those people who do catch the virus, many of them, the effect will be like a bad flu. Those people who are actually hospitalised, then we do have very good treatments for these.
And anyone breaking the rules risks being dispersed, fined and possibly arrested. As your Prime Minister, I must do what is necessary to stop the spread of the virus and to save lives.
The government reaction is causing more deaths now and will cause far more deaths in the future than the virus itself.